Hello! Today we're going to talk about what technical writing is and what technical writers do. So we should probably start with a definition. The most basic definition of technical writing is the communication of technical information to lay audiences and alternatively technical audiences. So as you'll see throughout the semester, technical writers create documents like instruction sets and medical care explanations that are read by the general public who have no scientific background. But they also create documents like grant proposals, client briefs, and lab reports for audiences who do have some scientific background, but just not the same background or as much knowledge as the writer. The better question to ask is, what are the work patterns of technical communicators? That is, what do they actually do? Now, within the multiple types of documents we just talked about, there are three basic work tasks that we like to say technical writers perform. And you'll see and practice each of these tasks throughout the documents we create this semester. But today we're just going to take a general look. First and foremost, technical writers are information designers. Now the natural question is, what's the difference between information design and simply writing something? Here's a good example of that difference. This is the dash of a car. How many of these 64 separate warning lights can you tell the meaning of? Some of them are obvious, but some are impossible to understand without turning to a manual or having detailed knowledge of what these lights are before you see this image. This is an example of bad information design. Ideally, and increasingly this is the case, a dashboard will not only tell the driver what exactly is wrong with the car, but also what to do about that. How many of you have faced a similarly impossible to understand control panel on some technical equipment, or some seemingly impossible to understand instructions for putting furniture together? Things don't have to be difficult to understand, and when information isn't designed clearly, it's not only frustrating, but as this example shows, it can be dangerous. The second major work activity of technical writers is user advocacy. How many of you have thought and researched who the users are of your designs in other classes? I ask this question every semester, and almost every student says that they haven't necessarily done it, or at least not to a large degree. In this class, in every single assignment, you're going to ask yourself, who is using this text, and what do they want, and how can I make it more useful? That's taking into account rhetorical positions. That is, we want to know how users approach text, how they engage with the text, and how we can make that text more useful and rewarding for that user. Designer Donald Norman calls this standard of production user-centered design. A lot of engineers and designers like to think about efficiency, cost, and creativity when they design products, and that's all well and good. But they often never ask the user what they want or watch the user attempt to use that design before it goes to market. And if the user fails to use that product successfully, the user is almost always blamed. We call that user error. But as Norman says, most accidents are attributed to human error, but in almost all cases, the human error was the direct result of poor design. Now, fortunately, this is starting to improve. You see direct-to-consumer brands such as Blue Apron or Zinus that design products to be user-centered. That is, they have users in mind when they design instructions or even recipes. What they're attempting to cure, or what they're attempting to solve, is a failure in communication. I have these three questions listed to the right for you. What does the public know about fracking and earthquakes? Why have local Spanish-speaking families struggled to understand storm precautions? Why has the anti-vaccination movement thrived? These topics don't seem like they're related. But the root cause of each of these questions, that is, the reason why these questions are even asked today, is often due to a failure in communication. That is, it's often a failure in user-centered communication, because existing explanations and existing forms of communication about these topics don't adequately explain the subject. Here we have some other examples of poor user-centered design, as well as too good. So at the top left we have a row of light switches. Now, the only way to figure out what these light switches do if you've never used them before is a lot of trial and error. So we could call that user trial and error. Now, eventually they would be able to turn the lights on in the right room, which means that the design eventually would be successful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful. That's poor user-centered advocacy. That's not user advocacy. It's not user-centered design. Now look at the light switch below it. We see a floor plan. If you click one of the rooms, the light in that room will turn on. It's not only intuitive, but that's user-centered design. It's good information design. People can essentially figure out what that switch does without having to use so much trial and error. Let's take a look at the doors. You can see that the handles on the left don't necessarily lend themselves to pushing, but they do lend themselves to pulling. It may seem strange to say, but that's a technical writer at work. It's both information design and user-centered design at work. And here we have the bane of my existence for about 4 years, the office phone. While it does get the job done, it's very complicated to use, and oftentimes it takes a lot of trial and error. Once you do figure out how to use this phone, you're often a seasoned office worker who has paid their dues. However, in the year 2018, we should be able to design better than that. With better information design and better user-centered design and user advocacy, we can improve on designs such as these. Let's look at an example that's a bit higher stakes. Here we have some prescription bottles. You can see that there's inconsistent labeling. The branding is the clearest and not the medication or the directions. There's confusing numbers, a curved shape that can be difficult to hold for people with arthritis, tiny type, peel-off instructions in sections that are pasted over other sections. Nothing about these pill bottles are user-centered. Now let's take into account these other pill bottles designed by the Target pharmacy. Unfortunately, these pill bottles are no longer used ever since CVS took over. But we can still look at them as an example of good user-centered design. You can see that the prescription or the medication is listed in the biggest letters. You can see that there's clear directions for what the user should do. And you can see that the pill bottle is easy to hold. Not only that, they have these colored rings. And what these colored rings were for was to help people understand which pills were which, but also to understand who the pills were for. So if you had multiple people in the home with prescriptions, yellow could be for the father, red could be for a child. The final duty that technical writers have in the world is that they are stewards of writing in the organizations they work for. That is, they teach other people essentially to communicate well. Something I want to think about right now is who in the past in your science classes taught you how to write. For instance, who taught you to write a lab report? Were they good at teaching that? Were they terrible? Did they even teach it at all? Good technical writers are good teachers, and by that I mean they're good teachers because they show people how to communicate more clearly. One thing a lot of students ask, or really tell me, is that they don't need to be good writers because they aren't going to write on the job, and the businesses they work for have good writers already. And I tell them that's a fair point to make. But what I also say is that, at the very least, you'll make the writers who work for you have an easier time if you know how to deliver them good writing. And more importantly, it's been statistically shown that good writers and speakers, people who can explain why the research they are doing is important, or explain why the task they are doing is important, get promoted faster and paid more, and often are viewed as more helpful. One other thing that I like to mention, though, this is a bit more fun, is that although I'm happy as a technical writer to take people's money for writing for them, why pay someone else to do something that you can do yourself? Or, if you want to be a bit of an entrepreneur, you can use these writing skills to essentially get paid to write these technical documents for other people. For example, I've written for a website and created scannable blog posts that have earned me upwards of $200 to $500. Not even for over a page, but just a paragraph. There's money out there to get as a technical writer. So keep your eyes out for it and use your skills. But more than anything, clear communication is a very important skill to have, and it's very useful to others around you. Okay, so before we end today, I'd like to switch gears and talk about something a little bit different. Your first lesson in writing, and something I want to really drill into you, is scanability. That is, making your documents scannable. Scanability is one of the most important lessons for technical writers to learn, because in other classes, no one writes scannable things. We just write big blocks of text. But in the real world, nobody wants to read that. Nobody wants to read big blocks of text. People jump around between sections. They read headings, look at pictures. And so you need to design for that. And to do so, a technical writer will use what is called the dual path reading. What your goal will be in all the documents you create in this class is to imagine two readers. First, the reader who deeply cares about every minute detail and read everything. But secondly, and more importantly, you need to imagine a reader like a boss or client who isn't interested in all the details, but just wants to jump around the text between sections. For that second reader, you use headings, subheadings, bullets, numbered lists, captioned images, and short paragraphs. You also, and this seems in a way slightly counterintuitive, you do not use a bunch of technical jargon. A technical writer clarifies. They take that technical jargon and they make it understandable. Here's two resumes. The one on the left is not scannable. It doesn't take the dual stream approach, and it's, well, to be honest, a bit ugly, and no one wants to read it. If you were to turn that in this class, you would get an F. The one on the right, however, creates a visual hierarchy by using headings and sections, has bullet points, has columns, and I actually want to read it because I'm pretty sure that I could in a short amount of time. Now, outside of the scope of this class, think about that in a professional setting if you are trying to apply to your dream job. We wouldn't want to apply with the resume on the left, right? We would want something that looks like the resume on the right. So here we have a bit of a heat map. So all it's trying to show you is that people have behaviors when they read, and that is, when you're looking at scanability, you want to take into account what people see first. What is their reading pattern? What's the visual hierarchy? How are things grouped? Etc., etc. The key here is to recognize that most people don't make it to the bottom of the page, right? So you want to take that into account. My question for you would be is, where should you put your important information? Where should you try to draw people's eyes? Here we have an infographic, probably one of the better versions of technical communication today. Using image and text together, you can see that this information is much easier to get through. Now imagine if this was all in a bunch of chunks of text and nothing else. You wouldn't really want to read it, right? This is what technical communicators do, in a nutshell. They can take that information and they can present it in the way that's much more useful, readable, and scannable. Now if we take a step back into the past, while this image is fun for nostalgia, we can see that it's not very scannable. Information can be lost because there's information overload. That's bad information design, this bad user advocacy and bad user-centered design. Now, if you go and look at Coca-Cola ads today, you can see that they're starting to get a lot more minimal, right? They're essentially making things much more scannable. And the result of that, it's been massively successful. Okay, but all of this is to say is one thing. When information is designed poorly, we often don't trust it. So here's a good example of that. Which of these gas station pumps would you be more likely to trust your credit card information with? Now, for better or for worse, we trust good-looking things, and even good-looking people, more than we trust ugly things. And I know that's a really terrible thing to say, but an interesting example of this is a 1995 study done by Japanese researchers Kuroso and Kashimura. They created two ATMs, both with the exact same functionality, and they made one ugly and one pretty. What pretty means for an ATM, I don't really know. But what they did is they asked a set of people to use these ATMs, and the overwhelming majority felt the ugly ATM worked worse compared to the pretty one. Question is why? Well, we get less frustrated with pretty things. We're more willing to work through them. So all this is to say, there's a reason why I'm making you create good-looking texts, from resumes to research proposals this semester. The document will just be much more successful. A little fun thought experiment for you guys to work on is go look at websites online. If you were to purchase something from a website that looks like Amazon, the ethos of that website, I guess, the professionalism behind it, often makes people more comfortable about spending their money. Now go to a website that looks like it came straight out of 1991 or 1993. Now, not many websites back then, but you understand what I'm saying. You might be less willing to put your credit card information, right? Again, that is in a way information design and user-centered design. Okay, that is all for today. I look forward to speaking with you again next time, and make sure to keep on top of those modules and those announcements. Okay.